Do American sodas really contain flame retardant? Wait a second, so how much exactly of chlorinated chicken would I have to eat before I actually got sick? Why is it illegal to use American apples if I want to make that pie right here in Germany? Hi guys, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, my name's Ashton, and along with my husband Jonathan and our son Jack, we're the Black Forest family. In last week's episode, we took a look at 4 foods that you can find right on the store shelves here in Germany that are banned in the United States. But in today's episode, we're going to reverse that exercise and take a look at 4 American foods that are verboten here in Germany. And we'll be dispelling a few food myths and answering some not so sweet questions along the way. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Making the rounds on social media was a claim that Mountain Dew for years included a dangerous chemical that is also used as a flame retardant. And that dangerous chemical happens to be at the heart of why it is banned in the European Union, including right here in Germany. In fact, that post on Facebook racked up over 1 million likes. But is it actually true? BVO, or brominated vegetable oil, could be used and has been patented as a flame retardant. But the fact that it's patented doesn't mean that it's common use, or related to the vast majority of other brominated flame retardants. Honestly guys, comparing the two would kind of be like saying that Splenda, a common sweetener, is the same thing as bleach because they both happen to contain chlorine. So that Facebook post is extremely misleading. Brominated vegetable oil has been used as a food additive since the 1930s. BVO works as an emulsifier, particularly in beverages that use citrus oils, to keep the oil from floating to the top of the drink. And according to the Mayo Clinic, bromine, one of its key ingredients, can irritate the skin and mucous membranes, as well as cause headaches, memory loss, and impaired balance and coordination. And that's exactly why, for decades, you wouldn't see Mountain Dew or caffeine-free Sundrop on store shelves within the European Union, Japan, or India. And now, that sounds rather scary, but I was kind of curious, is BVO really all that problematic? And here's the thing. Yes, there have been reports of people experiencing memory loss and skin and nerve problems after drinking excessive amounts, as in more than 2 liters a day of soda containing BVO. And I don't want to sound callous here, but if you're drinking more than 2 liters of any soda per day, I would reckon to say that you're probably going to have a few health problems. However, while few people are likely to drink such large quantities, concern exists because bromine appears to build up in the body. It gets worse the longer you drink it. So although the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, originally categorized BVO as, quote, generally recognized as safe, the agency did later reverse that decision. The FDA continues to allow use of BVO in small amounts while it performs additional toxicology studies. And in the meantime, as of 2020, Mountain Dew, which is manufactured by PepsiCo, no longer uses BVO in the main line of beverages. But the original BVO-containing formula is still sometimes sold as the lesser distributed Mountain Dew throwback beverage. So in the end, since Mountain Dew has since dropped BVO from its ingredient list, does that mean that the American cult classic citrus soda is primed to take over the German soda market? Not so fast. The #1 selling soda in the whole of Germany is Coca-Cola, with the exception of the state of Thuringia, preferring Vita Cola to Coke. So while yes, you can in fact find Mountain Dew on the store shelves right here in Germany, its sister soda, Mountain Dew Code Red, was famously discontinued in 2016 due to low sales. While chicken might be one of the healthier meats to eat in the United States, you might be surprised to learn that our chicken actually isn't seen as all that healthy. in other countries around the world. That's because the use of chlorine to wash chicken carcasses, which according to the US National Chicken Council is used in approximately 10% of processing plants as the method to clean and prepare chicken for consumption in the United States, has been banned in the European Union since 1997. Washing the chickens in a strong chlorine solution, about 20 to 50 parts per million of chlorine, provides a brash, cost-effective method of killing any microorganisms on the surface of the bird, particularly bacteria such as species of Salmonella and Campylobacter. This helps prevent the meat from being contaminated with microbes during slaughter and evisceration. But here's what I find to actually be pretty interesting about this story. The European Food Safety Authority has actually agreed with US officials, publishing a report that found no significant safety concern associated with the application of 4 antimicrobial solutions, one of which being the chlorine used to clean chicken. And here's something that you also might find to be particularly interesting. According to some studies, you would need to consume 5% of your body weight in chlorinated chicken each day for an extended period of time for it to be considered any risk to your health from poultry alone. Nevertheless, authorities here in the EU stress that washing chickens with the solution does not replace the need for good hygienic practices during the processing of poultry carcasses. Because for Germany and the rest of the EU, the fear actually doesn't really have to do with the chlorine. It's that heavily soiled birds may not be sufficiently disinfected, and that relying on chlorine washing could lead to poorer hygiene standards overall. And ultimately, in the poultry business, a lot of this comes down to money and the efficient use of space. The majority of farmers out there do care about the rearing of their birds, but as profit margins can be very tight, animal welfare is sometimes sidelined to keep costs down. In the EU, cost of course is also important, but the law means that it can't come at the expense of the bird's basic welfare. So farmers here in Germany must abide by the legal minimum of space, light, and ventilation in all poultry houses. But by contrast, there are no laws governing this in the United States. The birds can be crammed in tightly so they have limited movement, with little light or ventilation. And this reduces production costs, but also increases the risk of disease and contamination in a flock. And really, for me, I happen to find that this debate is actually rather nuanced. Contrary to the shocking headlines that you might read online, the debate on chlorinated chicken actually has less to do with chlorine and more to do about animal welfare, and ultimately what that means for you as a consumer. Again, the larger concern is that if chlorine-washed meat is presented to the consumer as hygienic and clean, it could be seen as a distraction from the poor conditions under which the meat is produced. And ultimately, that claim does have some credibility to it. Because despite claims that chlorine treatments reduce the risk of bacterial contamination, the prevalence of Salmonella in German chickens is lower than that of chickens slaughtered and sold in the United States. Consider this. In 2019, 8% of US chickens tested positive for Salmonella, down from 11% according to consumer reports in the USDA. In contrast, the German Federal Institute for Risk and Assessment found that less than 1% of chickens were positive for Salmonella in the same year. An apple a day might not actually keep the doctor away, at least if they're American, according to the authorities here in Germany and throughout the European Union. Making headlines back in 2014, the EU food safety regulators famously banned the pesticide-coated staple from the United States because of concerns surrounding diphenylamine, or DPA. DPA is an antioxidant that is used post-harvest to reduce superficial scald development in apples. It's also been shown to reduce external CO2 injury in susceptible apple cultivars during storage. However, regulators here in the EU also had concerns that it could be potentially carcinogenic. Emphasis on the word potentially. So in 2012, they asked manufacturers of DPA to prove that it's safe. Unfortunately, 2 years later, they concluded that the industry had not provided sufficient information, and that the many data gaps made it impossible to confirm the safety of DPA. Permitted residue levels of DPA in the US and many other countries is 10 parts per million. And prior to 2014, Canada, Europe, and China had been at 5 parts per million. But when the EU Commission ruled in late April of 2014 to reduce the permitted level of DPA residues from 5 parts per million down to 0.1 parts per million, it was quite literally a 50-fold reduction. So while it's not actually clear whether or not DPA poses any real risk to public health, the European Commission ultimately asked questions that the manufacturers of DPA couldn't answer. So this reduction ultimately was a huge shock to the American apple industry. Because at 0.1 parts per million, the level is so low it would require dedicated storage rooms and bins that were never exposed to any level of DPA. And since the US standard allows 100 times that limit, the risk of cross-contamination at, again, just 0.1 parts per million is just too high. And the ban on the import of American apples to the EU was, again, of course, a huge shock to producers, but it was especially devastating to those who sold to Germany. Because believe it or not, Germany is the #1 importer of apples in the world. In 2021, Germany imported an estimated $611.3 million worth of apples, accounting for a staggering 7.2% of total imported apples globally. And as you can see from this chart, today the majority of those apples come from Italy. So while there are few things more American than apple pie, it is a little bit ironic that if I wanted to make that apple pie right here at my home in the Black Forest, well, according to EU regulators, I can't actually use American apples in order to make it. You know, I'd imagine that the Germans, well, you guys are probably not so concerned about us Americans stealing your title as being arguably the best bread makers in the world. Perhaps that rivalry is best fought between the French with their delicious croissants, or maybe the Italians with fresh focaccia. Now, there's a showdown I would love to be a part of. But you know, for this final chapter, well, it might just keep us Americans out of the bread wars simply for legal reasons. Historically, flour was packed in cloth sacks and aged naturally by exposure to oxygen during long storage periods. But with industrialization and the advent of bulk handling systems, this mode of oxidation was no longer available. Enter into the scene potassium bromate, a powerful oxidizing agent that chemically ages flour much, much faster. It also does other helpful things like bleaching the dough so that it rises in the oven and is especially critical in poor crop years, something that could be more prevalent with climate change. Now, the FDA approved the use of this chemical in 1941 and based the allowable limits that were permitted in flour used in bread based on the expectation that the heat from the oven during baking converts the bromate into harmless bromide. But for well over 80 years now, scientists have been raising concerns about the use of bromate in flour. Studies found it to affect the nutritional quality of the bread and degrade vitamins A2, B1, B2, and niacin, which are the main vitamins available in bread. Other reports show that it could cause a cough or sore throat when inhaled and resulted in renal and thyroid cancer in rodents. And in 1998, the International Agency for Research on Cancer actually classified bromate as group B2. In other words, labeling it as possibly carcinogenic. So it probably comes as no surprise that the oxidizing agent used as a food additive when bread making, potassium bromate, has been banned in the EU, Canada, China, South Korea, and some South American countries. Now, to be fair here, federally speaking, it is still completely legal to use in the United States. However, there are some differences at the state level. Notably, California's Proposition 65 law dictates that brominated flour must be labeled as a carcinogen. Several restaurants in the US have voluntarily cut it out from their ingredient list, including Panera Bread, which added potassium bromate to its so-called no-no list, along with BHA, BHT, ADA, and other potentially harmful ingredients. Now here's the thing. I'm not gonna discourage anybody from trying to eat a cleaner diet, but labeling potassium bromate as potentially carcinogenic to humans, well, just stating that on face value, it's a little bit misleading. Because this category from the AIRC also includes things like gasoline exhaust and aloe vera, things that we come into contact with in our everyday lives, sometimes pretty frequently. So context is kind of everything here. And I really do think that bread it's a really good example of some of the core differences between the American and the German and EU food safety authorities, and the perspective that they take on different additives, colorings, or chemicals used in foods. As with many issues, a lot of this just comes down to bureaucracy. The governing body which regulates food in America, again the FDA, has a much different approach to additives, allergens, and labeling than the bureaucracies which govern food production here in Germany, and really throughout the European Union. The EU takes a proactive attitude towards food production, also known as the precautionary principle. Artificial ingredients and additives, like brominated vegetable oil that we talked about earlier in this video, they have been outright banned in European food production. European governing bodies also label other potentially risky ingredients accordingly, which serve as a warning to consumers. And that's why today, most additives that are banned in the European Union are still totally legal to use in the United States. Ultimately, it comes down to the fact that the US takes the exact opposite approach to monitoring food production. Rather than banning additives, chemicals, carcinogens, and other potentially harmful ingredients, the FDA doesn't ban or remove those potentially dangerous products until they've been proven to be risky. Now, this could mean that happens after harm has been actually done to the consumer. But basically, the FDA says that you have the burden of proof that it's bad, not that just the potential exists. But things are very different here in Germany. Food safety standards in the EU even regulate the size and color of the font on food packaging labels that list ingredients. In the US, the presence or use of genetically modified organisms in food isn't even required to be disclosed on food packaging. This type of procedure essentially makes corporations liable after the fact, rather than it being the other way around. So that leads me to the big question of this video. By the end of my research, I found myself wondering, do these different approaches by the FDA and the EU actually lead to different outcomes for consumers? And well, it depends. If you're talking about food poisoning, truthfully, it's difficult to estimate the number of people who get food poisoning every year. It's not always possible to prove someone got ill because of something they'd eaten, and they may not always go to a doctor or seek medical advice. So as a result, the estimates that you're going to read on different countries are very broad. They're also going to vary considerably due to how and when it was collected, and there are differences in the methodology behind the estimates. Also, real-world factors like access to medical care, which differs wildly between the US and Germany, can also affect the comparison. So the short answer is, we just don't know. What we do know, however, is that regardless of whether or not you're eating in the US or in Germany, food today is a heck of a lot safer than it used to be. And thanks to globalization, more stringent food regulations in one major market affects food quality and production in others. Because manufacturers want to sell their goods globally and keep costs low, rather than have to source different ingredients for different markets and worry about cross-contamination, many have actually just changed their standard recipes so that it complies everywhere. For example, the vast majority of American breads on the shelves no longer use potassium bromate because it is banned in the EU and Canada. Kraft and Velveeta macaroni and cheese no longer use red and yellow food dyes. Instead, they opt for natural food coloring. And like we've discussed in today's video, Mountain Dew no longer has BVO. There's a lot of misinformation out there on just how chemically saturated American foods are. Don't get me wrong, there's still a pretty good amount, but things are changing, in part due to regulations that are happening all the way across the Atlantic, right here in Germany and the European Union. On the next episode of the Black Forest Family, many of you know and love our channel for the deep dives we give on culture, life, and society between the US and Germany. But on next week's episode, I had a chance to sit down with a fellow international YouTuber and share our lived experiences and culture shocks that we've experienced studying, living, and building a family in Germany. Get ready for some personal stories and some perspectives from a Welsh and American point of view, and the 10 things we've learned to never do in Germany. You're in for a real treat with this one, guys. So, as always, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content, including next week's episode from the Black Forest family, hit that subscribe button. So, see you next Sunday. Tschüss!